Hello. Transitioning from standard economics to contemporary economics. Our framework is such that the level of development depends on economic policies, and economic policies are only as effective as the institutional framework of the country, and the institutional framework depends on the historical experience. Given this framework, we have considered two broad categories of models. The first one is classical and neoclassical models. The classical neoclassical models believe that all countries go through similar stages, just like the countries of Western Europe. They assume inclusive institutions, competitive markets, only minor market failures, and therefore governments, households, and firms have good incentives to act upon the economic policies. These models are represented by Rostow, Harrodamar, Lewis, the neoclassical counter-revolution with free market, public choice, and the market-friendly approach, as well as Solow and Romer. The policies that come out of the classical and neoclassical models are capital accumulation, so we should save and invest and industrialize. Focus on a market economy or let the market work its magic. So deregulate, privatize, openness, reduce tax rates, and so forth, as well as population control. To counter the classical and neoclassical models, we've been looking at international dependence theory. International dependency theory is radically different from the classical and neoclassical models, and they believe that countries do not go through similar stages, and therefore developing countries are not just like developed countries, only far further behind. And the reason is because of colonialism, and the new international economic order has created both extractive institution and an exploitative global economic system. This kind of thinking has been represented by the neo-colonial dependence theory and the false paradigm model. And economic policies that comes out of that kind of thinking is basically cutting the ties to the global economic system. So restrict imports, restrict foreign ownership, promote domestic production, so subsidize domestic industry. All right, so this is good, but I just want to spend a little bit more time to think about the Solow growth model and its economic policies in terms of the predictions, because that's going to create a counterweight or the benchmark against which the contemporary economic models of development will be measured. Again, so if we focus on classical, neoclassical economic models, then we have capital accumulation as well as the institutional framework and economic growth being driven in the long run by technology and so forth. And all of those components of growth that we are considering here are best represented by the Solow growth model. And the Solow growth model, of course, starts out with its production function here, where y equals a times k alpha L to the power 1 minus alpha. The model has constant returns to scale and diminishing marginal returns to both factors of production. Those assumptions are very important in order to solve the model, but right now what we want to do is just focus on the components of growth that comes out of the Solow growth model. So we have, of course, that A represents technology, K represents capital, and L represents labor. And technology within the model is labor augmenting, is of course is A, and the Solow growth model says that that technology is growing exogenously at a rate of G, and the endogenous Romer model says that no, technology is actually embodied in the capital stock, and they give us a relationship like this to kind of endogenize how technology grows over time. Both of those approaches are done in order for the models to overcome diminishing returns. So according to neoclassical growth models, the limit to growth is because of diminishing returns. So when you add more and more capitals, so when you accumulate capital, each unit of capital that you build up will have diminishing returns. That is, each extra unit of capital will yield less and less and less in terms of extra output until the extra output is not able to overcome the pressures from population growth and depreciation of capital due to time. However, another way of thinking about technology, or this A variable, is of course making technology a much broader concept. So it's not just machines or equipment, but it's also including things like marketing and management techniques, as well as institutional frameworks. This is very good. That is, thinking about technology in a more broader way is very important when we think about why some countries are rich while others are poor. That is, when we want to compare different steady states, that's a really important approach to take. However, when it comes down to actually explaining economic growth over time, sustainable economic growth, then we really are thinking about labor augmenting technological progress. Of course, another thing that we can do when we think about a solo growth model is to broaden our definition of capital. So it's not just physical capital, but it can also be human capital. And human capital is, of course, most famously represented by either education or healthcare. It really is anything that would make a worker more productive, anything that makes the worker able to produce more, even though you don't have, you have the same worker, but the worker is just better. And of course, if you want to increase the capital, then we need to save and invest. So this S variable in the solo growth model is what picks up that factor. And then, of course, labor, represented by the population growth rate N. And when we solve the solo growth model, we notice that the steady state is actually made lower, or the per capita income is going to be lower if the population growth rate is higher. To be more careful of what we have here, that A, S, and N, they are all factors that allow a country to reach a higher steady state, and therefore A, S, and N answers the question, why are some countries rich while others are poor? When it comes to sustainable economic growth, then we have to return to think about how to overcome diminishing returns, and then this A variable has to be growing in some way, either exogenously by the rate G or endogenously by some other way to incorporate technological growth into the capital stock. Anyway, so this is what we have done, and that kind of thinking is best represented by the diagram of the solo growth model. So I just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about that diagram. Of course, here's the diagram, and by now we're familiar with this one. It basically says that, there's a savings line here, and the shape of that savings line is the law of diminishing marginal returns. That is, this alpha is less than 1. But if you start at some point at this low rate of capital labor ratio, the saving is greater than the rate of population growth and rate of depreciation, and therefore the capital stock, delta K here, will be growing per capita. Again, because of the saving and investment is greater than the population growth and depreciation. And what happens then is, of course, that the next period's capital stock, so what happens is that K2 is equal to K1 plus delta K. So our K2 will be a higher level. At this level, once again we have saving greater than the population growth and depreciation rate, and therefore the next period's capital stock is also higher. So K3 equals K2 plus delta K. And of course, we can just keep going like this. And eventually, the country will approach its steady state, at which point it will stop growing unless there is some technological progress that will overcome this force of diminishing returns, the one that makes the savings rate closer and closer and closer to the rate of depreciation and population growth right there. However, as we transition from the neoclassical approach to a contemporary models of development, the important thing here, and this is where we have to spend a little bit time just to slow down and think about what the important thing is. But the important thing here is when you look at this diagram, you see that any country, wherever you start out, like if you start really poor at K1, you will eventually reach a high level of income. If you're a little bit richer when you start out, you still end up at the same rate of income. So wherever the country starts, it will eventually grow up, or grow and catch up, I should say, with developed nations. And really what we have here, again, if we're holding this A constant, is that all countries approach the same steady state. And this is, of course, very similar to the approach of Rostow, where he says that all countries will go through similar stages on their way to development. So the neoclassical model is just modeling that thinking, that wherever you start, if today you are an underdeveloped country, a country that is poor, a country that doesn't have much capital per worker, well, just give it some time, and the forces within the market approach, the market mechanism, will bring your country, to a high level of income. And the only thing that matters is that you let the market work its magic. So, try to accumulate capital, save and invest, industrialize, deregulate, privatize, open up your country to the rest of the world, and you too will one day be rich. So what we have here is a model that shows that there is a single optimal equilibrium. And all countries will approach that equilibrium. And another thing that you notice here is that it doesn't matter on what anybody else is doing. So for one country, it's not affected by what other countries do. And if you disaggregate that thinking, one firm is not affected by what other firms are doing, or one consumer is not affected by what any other consumer is doing. And that is the competitive market that the standard neoclassical models, economic models, are all based upon. But what we're doing now, and this is where I'm going to end here, I'm just going to ask the question, what if the world doesn't work this way? What if countries can be stuck in a poverty trap? And what we're going to be looking at when it comes to contemporary models of economic development is this notion that my best response, or my best policy, or my best choice depends on the choices and the actions of other individuals and firms, and maybe even countries. If that is the case, then our neoclassical model falls apart. And therefore, it is not obvious that a country who today is underdeveloped will grow and become rich if we just let the market work its magic. So what we're going to have to conclude instead is, or we have to consider the possibility that a country that is poor today has to do something differently. They need some massive government intervention. And what we're talking about, the words that you hear sometimes is you have to do deep government intervention, or countries need a big push approach. And those are the kinds of thinking that we're going to be exploring now that we think about the contemporary models of economic development. Thank you.